You're listening to KYRS, Medical Lake, Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. Coming to you now, it's Longwaves Radio with Gary Krug. I'll say right at the beginning of the station, right at the beginning of the program today, that the opinions expressed on Long Waves are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of KYRS, its staff, management, or underwriters. So welcome. If I can get this darn microphone to behave itself, which is seeming increasingly unlikely. All right, just when you think things are going well. Gee. Anyway, it's been a very interesting week, and in addition to our local fires, which finally seem to be getting under control thanks to the valiant effort of a lot of brave people and to a little rain and cool weather from Mother Nature. Well, that's one story I'm not going to be covering today, but I do want to cover an ongoing story. You know, I listened to the presidential rhetoric from the Republican clown car contenders, and everything's about these migrants, by which, you know, they mean Mexicans or Hondurans or, you know, any of these people coming up from down south. And it strikes me, watching the humanitarian crisis in the Middle East and in Europe unfold and continue to develop, that the European approach to all of this is really very, very different from the American approach. What do you do with people who are forced to migrate, who are forced to leave their homes, who are forced to become refugees? People who, yes, they could stay there. They could stay there. They could stay there and die. They could stay there and starve to death. They could do whatever. But the European response to this has been so interesting. I mean, here we sit, we who are responsible for so much of the poverty around the globe, so much of the poverty in Mexico. Remember how NAFTA was going to make everything better and improve trade, and we're going to have jobs in America, and the Mexicans were going to have jobs, and Canadians were going to have jobs, and this was all going to work out so swimmingly, and it failed miserably. Similarly, the continued destabilization of governments in South America contributes to economic problems, contributes to social problems, and people try to leave. Similarly, the U.S. starts wars in Libya, Iraq, Somalia, on and on and on, turns these viable, civilized countries into flaming hellholes, destitute of anything like civilization. And then when the people try to get out, well, we just look at it like it's some act of nature. It has nothing to do with us. But it does have a great deal to do with us, because we are, in fact, responsible for it. And the 100,000 or so refugees who are trying to get into Europe every month is putting an enormous strain on Europe and causing enormous divisions between those countries who don't want any immigrants and those who do. So I'll be talking quite a bit about that today. If we draw back and take kind of a long look at how big a deal this is for Europe, we have to consider what these changes are likely to bring about. And for this, I'm going to turn to the Russian political and military analyst Saker, and you can find his website at vineyardofthesaker.is. He's worth reading. He gets picked up in some various places, Un's Review and whatnot. But, quoting from a recent paper of his, quote, "The EU is on the verge of a social and cultural collapse. The undeniable reality is simple as it is stark. The EU cannot absorb so many refugees. The EU does not have the means to stop them. A massive influx of refugees presents a very complex security problem which EU countries are not equipped to deal with. All EU countries have three basic instruments they can use to protect themselves from unrest, disorders, crime, or invasion: the special security services, the police forces, and the military. The problem is that none of these, is capable of dealing with a refugee crisis." So the special security services, he says, are hopelessly outnumbered, and they're really not set up for tracking refugees. Mostly refugees are families, often extended ones, he writes. And while they sometimes include criminal gangs, this is far from always being the case. The problem is that, say, 10% of Kosovar drug dealers give a bagged name to all of the refugees from Kosovo, and the refugees themselves end up being treated like criminals. Special security forces rely heavily on informants, and foreign gangs are hard to infiltrate, blah, blah, blah. And he goes on to talk about why cops aren't very good at dealing with it, ordinary police, noting that their powers are, quote, severely limited, and they need to get a court order to do most of their work. And generally, as he points out, they deal with local criminals. As for the armed forces, he writes, the very best they can do is try to help close a border. In some cases, they can assist police forces in the case of civil disturbances, but that's about it. Thus, the various states of the EU neither have the means to lock their borders or deport most refugees, nor do they have the means to control them. Sure, there will always be politicians who will make promises about how they're going to send all these refugees back home, but that is a crude and blatant lie. The vast majority of these refugees are fleeing war, famine, and abject poverty, and there is no way anybody is going to send them back home. Well, contrast that with the rhetoric, if you will, of the Donald, Mr. Trump, and Ted Cruz, who keep trying to outdo themselves in being jerks and making all kinds of lunatic promises and lunatic suggestions about getting rid of all the immigrants and building giant walls and whatnot. Point of fact, we also don't have a way to deport most of them. Deport 11 million people? To where? By what means? Pay for this how? If it were even a good idea, which it's not, logistically, it's not one of the major problems we need to be faced with right now. And Europe, Saker points out, Europe really can't send them away, and it can't control its borders. But then he concludes, keeping them, however, is also impossible, at least in a cultural sense. For all the double plus good-thinking propaganda about integrating all races, creeds, and cultures, the reality is that there is absolutely nothing the EU has to offer to these refugees to make them want to integrate it. For all its sins and problems, at least the USA is offering an American dream, which, false as it might be, still inspires people worldwide, especially the unsophisticated and poorly educated. Not only that, but the U.S. society is largely acultural to begin with. Ask yourself, what is the American culture to begin with? If anything, it is really a melting pot as opposed to a tossed salad, meaning that whatever is tossed into the melting pot loses its original identity, while the overall mixture of the pot fails to produce a real indigenous culture, at least not in the European sense of the word. And what he sees, what Saker sees happening, is basically ghettos. And going back to the original meaning of the ghetto, ghettos were not poor places. They were ethnic enclaves. They were ethnic areas. And that is how the word was traditionally used. We changed it to fit some, to hide some inconvenient truths, if you will. And so what will likely happen is that the Africans, Syrians, Somalians, Libyans, and all of the subgroups of these people who go to Europe will likely form their own local ghettos. And Saker points out that in France already there are what the French call zones de non-droit, no-law zones. And he says these are far worse than anything you could see in the U.S., the no-go zones. And there are apparently such places in Europe, particularly in France, areas where, the cops don't go, areas where you don't go if you don't have business. It sounds a bit like the near south side of Chicago, which I have been to. Anyway, so there's this enormous level of aggravation. Europeans looking at this crisis, trying to figure it out, and it's hard to describe. It is hard to describe. So what's going on? Well, these refugees are creating an enormous burden on local economies and social services that were never designed to cope with so many people. And it's hard to spin up such services really quickly. You've got to build logistics. You've got to build a supporting administration. You've got to find the money. You've got to do all kinds of interesting things. Find people trained to deal with the problems you're having. And without these, what does Europe have to offer? Well, Saker points out, immigrants most definitely feel it almost every day. And again, this is why a notion of a U.S.-style melting pot in Europe isn't happening. The only thing Europe has to offer all of these hundreds of thousands of refugees is silent hostility fed by rage, disgust, and helplessness. Even those locals who used to be refugees themselves in the past are now disgusted and very hostile to the new waves of refugees coming in. And of course, this is not all the refugees. But Saker is pointing out an issue of how do you integrate this many people so quickly into a culture, into your environment? And the answer is simply, you don't do it. It cannot be done. But again, as a direct result of Hillary Clinton's destruction of Libya, and she's got to own this one. This was her baby. George W. and Dick Cheney's destruction of Iraq, Barack Obama's destruction of Syria, and on and on and on. As a direct result, we've destroyed countries where people lived comfortably and happily and had futures. Just wipe them out. So the outcome is people are bailing. Something like 4.5 million Syrian refugees have left the country. Some 12 million people have been displaced internally. And this in a country of about 20, last number I think I remember is about 28 million people. So an enormous percentage of the population is displaced. And yet, Syria is still holding it together. Whatever you can say bad about Bashar al-Assad, he is holding his country together. Anyway, back to the migrants. Al Bawada News from the United Arab Emirates reported on August 30th that the death toll has risen to 119 due to the capsizing of 2 boats carrying migrants after the Libyan Coast Guard discovered 39 additional bodies. On Friday, Libyan authorities discovered the bodies of at least 80 drowned African and Middle East asylum seekers in the water off the coast of the western city Zuwara. So they revised that number up considerably. Another 198 would-be asylum seekers had been aboard the vessels. They continue to search for bodies and survivors. So this is just Libya, and this is just one incident. But there are incidents like this every day. And if you've seen the pictures of African migrants, African refugees, people fleeing the hell that our government created for them, fleeing. In the first 6 months of this year alone, more than 2,350 would-be asylum seekers and or refugees have died off Libya's coast while trying to reach the shores of Europe. Now, last year, for the same period, it was 2,081. And somehow, some 255, I've seen numbers as high as 300,000 people have successfully gotten to Europe. Almost 100,000 of them came from Syria, 25,000 from Eritrea, and 32,000 from Afghanistan. That's interesting. That's a lot of people. Syria, Eritrea, Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq. You stack them up like cordwood. We're into another body count, aren't we? Well, on the bright side, in spite of what Saker said about governments and being unable to integrate all of these people, despite some governments taking kind of hardline positions on immigration, and this is especially true in some of the newer EU nations over on the east side, the Icelandic government had announced it would only accept 50 refugees. We got 300,000 people in the whole country, okay? We have more people in the Spokane metropolitan area than Iceland has in the whole country. They said they would take 50. Well, here's what happened. More than 12,000 people took to Facebook and to other social media sites offering their homes specifically to Syrians. One woman wrote, quote, "I'm a single mother with a 6-year-old son. We can take a child in need. I'm a teacher and would teach the child to speak, read, and write Icelandic and adjust to Icelandic society. We have toys, a bed, clothes, everything a child needs. I would, of course, pay for the airplane ticket." Another family said, "I want to help one displaced family have the chance to live the carefree life that I do. We as a family are willing to provide the refugees with temporary housing, clothing, and other assistance. I am a teacher and I can help children with their learning." So in the light of this outpouring from Iceland, 12,000 people, the Prime Minister, Gunnlaugsson, said he was aware of the increasingly popular pressure to take in more refugees, and they're going to go back and re-examine their numbers. Now contrast this with the idea in the U.S. Oh, we'll take you, but you got to come legally. We don't even want the ones who want to come legally, although they are the only thing in the world keeping our tech industry running, and that is true. We don't have enough engineers, computer programmers, high-end tech people. We would be lost without the H-1N visas. We truly would. So Iceland's actually looking at raising their numbers. And it's not just the Icelanders. German football fans held up signs at matches all over Germany, welcoming Syrians fleeing prosecution. And German citizens are likewise offering their homes to the refugees. What a wonderfully Christian thing to do. How civilized, how filled with philos and charity to open up one's home to refugees. And in the streets of Vienna, just this last week, more than 20,000 people marched to protest the ill treatment of refugees after the bodies of 71 people were found in an abandoned truck last week. They were horrified at this. Horrified at this. And turning to the EU, if we look to the EU, we see there's also a desire to raise the numbers of refugees that they will take from these countries. After Corbyn, at the debate, which I watched parts of, the Labour Party debate, after Corbyn said, seriously, we're responsible for this as much as the Americans are, and we ought to own up and do our bit. Well, the other two Labour leaders, not to be outdone in compassion, the other two candidates, including the Shadow Home Minister Yvette Cooper, said that the UK should take as many as 10,000 people from the Middle East. I presume she's referring to 10,000 people each month from Syria, Iraq, and Libya. And in a speech to the Center for European Reform, Ms. Cooper remarked that if each town housed 10 refugee families, that the UK could take 10,000 people each month. She went on to say, this has become a humanitarian crisis on a scale we have not seen on our continent since the Second World War, yet we seemed paralyzed to respond. Why are they paralyzed to respond? It seems like Brits want them to help. It seems like Germans and Austrians and Icelanders and a lot of other people, French, are saying they will take all they can get. Germany, in fact, eased its asylum restrictions for Syrian refugees, saying basically they'll take whatever comes. They've waived visa checks to Austria and Germany. And so these trains, utterly packed. I've seen the photographs of people sleeping, stacked in the hallways of the trains. Germany and Austria waived their visas for these migrants and refugees and just said, okay, you're here. In Budapest, they had to evacuate the train station on Tuesday as this overflow of people tried to get onto the trains. Apparently, hundreds of passengers demonstrated chanting, Germany, Germany. I'm not sure in what language, but Germany, Germany. Now, this is a bit of a turnaround for some of these countries, particularly for the UK. Until early last year, 2014, the official policy of the UK on Syrian asylum seekers and refugees was to offer humanitarian aid rather than taking them in. Humanitarian aid will send them some MREs and lots of plastic bottles of water and little porta potties, this kind of thing. But there was so much demand and high-profile public demand that the UK came up with this thing called the Vulnerable Persons Relocation Scheme, which prioritizes victims of sexual violence and torture, elderly and disabled. So the UN High Commissioner asked members last December to take 130,000 refugees. And so far, 187 Syrians relocated to the UK, according to a House of Commons document. Another 4,000 have come to the UK independently and then claimed asylum. But a senior lecturer at Queen Mary University of London said these 4,000 who have come independently, are, quote, mostly the wealthy and or educated, and not the same as resettling refugees. This does little to ease the burden on those states hosting the most in need. Now, the Middle East Eye on this topic, writing August 30th, 2015, pointed out that as thousands of refugees continue to flee Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Western governments are struggling to cope with a snowballing humanitarian crisis. And this was very much Saker's point earlier. Hungary is building a fence to ward off refugees. Shades of Donald Trump. Slovakia says it will only accept Christian refugees, which got them a black mark in the book from the UN. The president of the Italian Red Cross had this to say: "We have to remember refugees are human beings. Often they have no choice but to leave their homes, and they must have unhindered access to basic human rights, in particular the right to protection and health care." Those are noble words from the president of the Italian Red Cross. Unhindered access to basic human rights, protection and health care. We don't even do that for citizens in this country. Rights to protection and health care? Are you mad? That sounds like communism. Anyway, of all of Europe, Sweden and Germany have absorbed apparently about 43% of the asylum seekers, and this is from Middle East Eye. Germany has taken in over 44,000 Syrian refugees this year, but again, there have been attacks on these refugees, mostly from neo-Nazi groups, because just as in the U.S., these red-blooded, pure-blooded, they will taint our race, they'll destroy our religion, these people exist in Germany as well as here and in a lot of places. And so this is, red meat for them. This is the red flag that tells them, I've got to go out here and do something. And again, as I cited earlier, some 2,500 refugees have died trying to cross the Mediterranean this year. So we have Western European countries complaining about hundreds of thousands of refugees flooding up their shores. Mideast Eye asks the question, what about the 3.5 million Syrian refugees hosted now by Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon? 3.5 million. Is y'all upset about 300,000? And they're talking about a factor of 10 greater in one country, or in a handful of countries, Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, and Turkey being the only one of those countries that's really in a position to offer a great deal. They have the most money. They're also NATO. So Europe's going to squabble. People are going to die. And Merkel, Angela Merkel, the Iron Woman of Germany, is on record as saying this is an enormous humanitarian crisis, one of the worst crises ever the EU has ever faced, worse than the Greek financial meltdown. Well, duh. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is horrified and heartbroken, as are all decent people, at the latest loss of lives. But what can the UN do except slap people on the wrist and put black stars by their names in the book of, UN favors? International laws have stipulated, and states have long recognized, the right of refugees to protection and asylum, said General Ban Ki-moon. Well, yeah, some have in some cases, some not in others. the right of refugees to protection and asylum. So the boat people of Australia, I mean, are they refugees, the people trying to escape from Malaysia, the people trying to escape from Indonesia? Are they refugees? Well, Australia tends to lock them up in big kind of horrific camps in the middle of nowhere in the outback, or ship them off to God-forsaken islands like Vanuatu and hold them there without legal protection, without anything, just people who don't exist. And of course they're working through the cases, but Moon continued saying, this is not only a matter of international law, it's also our duty as human beings. Yes, it is our duty as human beings. And that should be the best case for this, because international law is routinely broken by those with enough chutzpah to violate international law, or those with enough power to violate international laws, such as the United States and often the UK and similar such places. So the president of the Italian Red Cross, says, on our side we ask for humanitarian corridors, respect for human dignity, and respect for the Geneva Conventions regarding treatment of civilians in war zones, for reaching everyone suffering. Again, noble sentiments. Noble sentiments. Whether anybody is listening to this is, well, that's the question, isn't it? Whether anybody is listening to this. And Francesco Rocca continued, regarding the people who are relocating, we have to remember they're human beings. Often they have no choice but to leave their homes, and they must have unhindered access, again, to basic human rights. And so it goes. So what about the U.S., I hear you cry? We're just stepping right up to the plate and doing our usual goodness, aren't we just? Behave, microphone. It battles me. Well, yes and no. We're not being that stand-up. Not nearly as stand-up as we should be, could be, ought to be, might be. That's perhaps an improvement. Nope, absolutely not. Okay. Anyway, the U.S. says that this is 25 August. The U.S. expects to accept between 5,000 and 8,000 Syrian refugees in 2016. And they said that some 15,000 refugees had been referred to the U.S. for resettlement by the UN, but I'm not sure what referral means. It may be, hey, could you look at these cases and see if you can take them? And in fact, in December of last year, Washington said it had received 9,000 referrals. But maybe they've gotten 3,000 since then. The U.S. also previously said it would admit between 1,000 and 2,000 refugees in fiscal year 2015 and increase that number by a few thousand in 2016. Yeah. Wouldn't that be a good thing? So this is State Department spokesperson John Kirby, who probably got kind of beat up a bit for not taking more of the 4 million refugees trying to get out of Syria in a war that we largely started and are certainly continuing to inflame and fund and provide weapons and support in, to none other than our good friends Al-Qaeda. So Kirby said, well, the U.S. is a leader in accepting refugees and contributing financially to resettlement efforts, but this work was not the metric of success here. And so what we're really committed to is helping foster the kind of political transition inside Syria so that it is a safe environment for Syrian people to return, including the millions that are seeking refuge in Turkey right now. So political transition inside of Turkey. So let me get this straight. The political transition, let's see. If it goes the way it's going, ISIS carves up a big chunk of Turkey, a big chunk of Syria and claims it. Al-Qaeda's got the other big chunk, and Turkey takes the top. And this is the safe land they're going to return to? This is the political transition we're working for? How did that work out in Libya? How did that work out in Iraq? How's that working out for us in Afghanistan? This is the kind of double talk and gibberish and just outright prevarication for which the U.S. State Department is justly famed. I'm surprised they didn't drag out Jen Psaki to talk about this one. But nope, they had to go to Mr. Kirby. Now, to be fair, the U.S. has contributed about $4 billion in humanitarian aid over the last several years. Since 2011, about $4 billion in humanitarian aid, whatever that is. And I'm still not entirely sure. So, here we are. We're going to take 7,000 to 8,000, maybe. And meanwhile, we're going to send humanitarian aid, probably boxes and boxes of Bibles and condoms. And, just some odd mortar rounds and tows and, some RPGs that we picked up on the cheap in Tripoli. Probably that kind of humanitarian aid. The kind of humanitarian aid we were dropping to the Contras, you recall, in Nicaragua back in the day. But no, I have some actually officious statements here from the State Department and from my other favorite organization, the USAID. Oh, dear. Let's see if I can get through these and actually get to a conclusion before I run out of time. So, let's see. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. This is the fact sheet from the Office of the Spokesperson about U.S. humanitarian assistance in Syria. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Samantha Power announced today at the Third International Humanitarian Pledging Conference for Syria in Kuwait that the United States will provide nearly $508 million in additional life-saving assistance to benefit those affected by the war in Syria. This is the largest announcement of funding the United States has made for this humanitarian crisis, which demonstrates the unprecedented magnitude of suffering and urgent needs. So, since the start of 2011, the U.S. has thrown some $3.7 billion, billion with a B, into Syria. Meanwhile, working to destabilize the Syrian government and enable extremist militant groups like Daesh and Al-Qaeda to continue to destabilize the country. Now, what is wrong with this picture? This is where you go in and you bomb a village, kill a bunch of the people there, destroy the infrastructure, terrorize everyone, and then come in with some boxes of Band-Aids and tinctures and MREs and bottles of water, take a few pictures, and then it all goes away. Food, water, medical care, shelter, protection to the millions of civilians suffering inside Syria. Hey, here's a thought. Why don't we provide food, water, medical care, shelter, protection, and other necessities to millions of homeless and poor in the U.S. and stop these damned crazy, endless, pointless wars? Whoa. $3.7 billion. And notice nobody's jumping up and down. Nobody in the Republican clown car is pointing at this and going, "Oh, we're spending all this." Rah, 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 rah. But you can bet your bottom dollar if we were giving it to homeless and poor in the U.S., they would be screaming. Screaming. In fact, though, according to the State Department, the United States provided more than $1.5 billion to those affected by the conflict in fiscal year 2014, the largest single amount of assistance the United States ever provided to a single crisis in 1 year. I would love to see the accounting on that $1.5 billion. I don't think I have a snowball's chance in hell of ever coming across it, but it would be interesting to see. So anyway, UN's asking for more money, people are asking for money, blah, 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 usual State Department stuff. So the United States recognizes that along with our emergency relief response, we must look at the longer-term development needs of Syria's neighbors, boosting their health care and education systems, supporting their economies amid the strain of hosting millions of refugees. This funding will be programmed in a manner that is mindful of the development needs and host communities in those countries. Okay, again, I say, why are we not okay doing this here? Why are we not okay boosting our own healthcare and education systems rather than blowing up other countries and then shipping support over there so we can slap ourselves on the back on the one hand and feel good about doing it? Meanwhile, the neocons and neolibs and the John McCains and Hillary Clintons of the world can run off and blow up more countries for no good reason at all. Because nothing they say makes any sense, and nothing they do ever works. Yes, we should provide aid to people who need aid. But I'm sure my listeners get the point here. So, and they go on with some more feel-good stuff, Well, here's the interesting paragraph from the State Department. Quote, the onslaught against civilians and aid organizations by the Syrian regime and extremist groups we are seeing shows that the principles of humanitarianism that founded the United Nations remain under attack from multiple sides in Syria. We cannot allow this regressive brutality to go unchallenged. Impartial and neutral humanitarian organizations must be allowed to do their jobs. Civilians must be protected. Notice this, right? The onslaught against civilians and aid organizations by the Syrian regime and extremist groups. Stop? By whom exactly? The extremist groups like Al-Qaeda, who we're funding, and there are open papers about using Al-Qaeda and other proxy armies to do our bidding, and Turkey is certainly the pipeline of everything to ISIS. Meanwhile, much of the weaponry over there was either supplied by us, the Saudis and the UAE, and a lot of it came from Libya. So, to say it's the Syrian regime and extremist groups, wait. Who exactly has the Syrian regime attacked? I thought they were defending themselves against an onslaught of outside terrorist groups, mostly formed in Iraq. But golly gosh. I'm not in the State Department, so I must not know what the hell I'm talking about. So, as I said before, 12.5 million people in need of humanitarian assistance inside Syria. And this is from the USAID. Now, I mentioned a little while ago how the USAID is one of my least favorite organizations, partly because it's one of those organizations that on the one hand claims to be doing good, and on the other hand has a rather shady history going right back to the Reagan years. and probably before, but certainly the Reagan years, has a rather shady history for undermining governments, for supporting insurgencies, for doing all kinds of, well, work that once would have been left to the CIA. But, gee, I mean, if you've got another group sitting around who can do it. And when you read through these documents, it is the most bizarre telling of the history of the conflict in Syria you could ever expect to run into. It is just absolutely nuts. Absolutely nuts. It is so riddled with propaganda and double good talk. It's hard to imagine that anybody could write this claptrap. It's harder to imagine that anybody would expect normal human beings to read this and think it were true. But hope springs eternal in the minds of stupid people, especially those in the State Department. Anyway, I got a couple of things to say before I get out of here about next week and about the fund drive that is coming up. But before I get to all of that, there was a rather interesting piece in The Guardian, which is an iffy paper. It used to be somewhat better. But there were some interesting thoughts, and there often are. This is by Owen Jones. And the title of the piece is Refugees Are Human. The simple fact seems to have been forgotten. They're not people. Nobody would tolerate hearing about the drowning of human beings over and over again. At best, they're bleak but intangible statistics, the object of a bit of tutting before the mundane everyday life takes over. For others, they are an unwanted and uninvited swarm that Fortress Europe must keep out, full of undeceiving would-be leeches who want, who have no place in the West. In the hierarchy of death, anyone labeled a migrant must take their place somewhere near the bottom. It is a dehumanized world. For all too many people, it is somewhere down there with petty criminal. And who mourns petty criminals? As the news of 200 dead refugees drowned off the coast of Libya filters fleetingly into the news coverage, the only guarantee is that more will drown. And with news of more than 70 refugees found dead in a truck in Austria, to try to imagine their last living moments triggers a horrible feeling in the pit of the stomach. We know that more bodies will be found in more trucks. And those of us who want more sympathetic treatment of people fleeing desperate situations have failed to win over public opinion, and the cost of that is death. Other than a tiny portion of sociopaths, our species is naturally empathic. For those who believe that hostility to human beings from other countries who have lost the lottery of life is somehow hardwired into us, there is evidence to the contrary. Germany takes in, and by us, he's of course, Mr. Jones is referring to the Brits. Germany takes in around 4 times as many refugees as Britain does. For every Syrian asylum seeker received by Britain, Germany gets 27. And despite German generosity comparing starkly with our own, half of Germans polled support letting in even more refugees. Wow. We can tell people that those reaching Europe represent a tiny fraction of the world's refugee population. That while developing countries housed 70% of refugees a decade ago, that has now leapt to 86%. Far smaller and poorer countries take in far more than us, such as Lebanon, with its population of around 4.5 million, including 1.3 million Syrian refugees. 4.5 million people. Think about that. Taking in 1.3 million Syrian refugees. Other than a tiny proportion of sociopaths, our species is naturally empathetic. It is only when we strip the humanity from people, when we stop imagining them to be quite like us, that our empathic nature is eroded. This allows us to either accept the misery of others or even to inflict it on them. Right-wing newspapers hunt down extreme and unsympathetic stories of refugees, and we fight back with statistics. Instead, we need to show the reality of the refugees, their names, their faces, their ambitions, their fears, their loves, what they fled. The solution to global human misery is not to extricate a tiny, lucky number and parachute them into richer countries. We need the West to take responsibility for disaster zones it helped create, like Libya and Iraq. We should pressure our governments to do more to solve situations that compel human beings to flee. At home, communities with higher levels of both migrants and refugees should be given extra resources and support. But as long as there is misery, people will flee it, and a tiny proportion will come this far. If we want to help them, we need to change public attitudes by humanizing refugees. If we fail, then more and more women, men, and children will spend their last few hours drowning in seas or suffocating in lorries. It is as bleak as that. And this concludes today's show. I'd like to thank you for listening. I will not be here next week. What I'm going to play is a rebroadcast of this show with some bits put in it. Next week is actually our fund drive, and I'm not going to make a pitch now, but there'll be some in next week's show, and there'll be some on a lot of the other shows. And this is a good time for everybody listening out there to show your support in some tangible ways to KYRS. You've been listening to Long Waves Radio, and I'll remind you again, you're also listening to KYRS Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1, 92.3. As I say, I'll be back in 2 weeks with a new show. And until then, stay smart, stay safe, stay human. Till then, bye-bye.